right, welcome. My name is Julia Sullivan. I'm the chef and co-owner of Henrietta Red in Nashville, Tennessee. We've been buying a lot of your oysters for the last 7 years. I'm also on the board of Oysters South and curated this panel of talking about sort of what chefs and restaurants want. So, we've seen sort of the academic angle and the grower angle, and hopefully to kind of tie it all together and talk about, hatchery to table. At the end of the day, what are chefs, what are consumers looking for, what kind of feedback can we have? And then I would really encourage you to hook into some of the ideas that we're talking about and think of some questions that we can visit at the end. So I'm just gonna start with introductions. Jeremy, if you wanna start maybe in like 60 seconds or less, introduce yourself and give us a little context.
It won't take 60 seconds. I'm Jeremy Sewell, chef owner of Row 34. I have oyster bars in New England, so I'm not sure why they invited me, but here I am from New England. I've worked, with a lot of small oyster farmers over the years in New England, really trying to help these kind of small farms that have sprouted up over the last 7 years get started, and really committed to that. And I see a lot of that happening down here.
Nicole Mills, I'm the chef at Pesh Seafood Grill here in New Orleans. We serve only Gulf seafood.
I'm Jackie Blanchard from Sukiban, uptown New Orleans, chef and owner, also in Coutelier, Japanese cutlery shop. I grew up in South Louisiana, so oysters are part of my DNA. So it's been beautiful to see the evolution of cultivation that's happened over my lifetime and sort of the new trajectory that this industry is taking. And it's a really beautiful breath of fresh air and surrounded by amazing, passionate people willing to push the agenda for the future of oysters.
I'm Jamie. I'm the farm chef in Marshall at Hog Island at our, original first location. I've been with the company for about 6 years now.
You want 2 microphones? Do both of these?
No. Keep
that down there. I'm JT McKissick. I work for Evans Meats and Seafood out of Birmingham, Alabama. I run the sales branch of the company. We're a family-owned and operated meat, seafood, and specialty company. We do distribution in about 6 states here in the Southeast, and we are lucky and fortunate enough to sell a lot of all of your wonderful oysters, and just happy to be here.
Great. Okay, so our first question, I'm gonna ask Jeremy, Nicole, Jamie, and JT. Lots of J's on this panel. So one of the reasons I invited Jeremy and kind of selected this group is because there are some interesting differences between your regional diversity, your proximity to respective coastlines, relationships to oyster farms. So could y'all start by speaking a little bit to those relationships to the farms on your menus and how maybe that's shaped a little bit by your region?
Yeah, so one of my business partners a few years ago was Island Creek Oysters. They were actually owned the restaurants with me. COVID ruined that like it did a lot of things, but still our primary vendor. But, for us, it kind of started with the first oyster bar was like, how do we kind of take Island Creek, the farm, introduce that into a restaurant in a way that felt, kind of authentic. And then from there, you just, you kind of branch out. I lived on the West Coast for a while, so, my first oyster I ever ate in the West Coast was a Hog Island, so I wanted Hog Islands on the menu. And then you start meeting other farmers from around New England. And we really wanted to kind of celebrate what they did and talk about what they did and tell their story. And really, the problem is chefs think they know best, and very rarely do we, but sometimes we always think we do. So it's really, we're a steward of their product. So I think, our job was to present, the farm, the oyster in the best way possible and try to connect those dots. And when you can connect the dots from the farm to the consumer and have the staff buy in, and the restaurant's just a conduit to get from the farm to the consumer, and kind of honor that product and tell that story in a way that felt kind of easy, not forced. I mean, that's a really powerful moment for the guests to kind of experience that, and the staff loves talking about it. So that was really what we kind of focus on is finding those farms and that we're excited about, that are excited about growing oysters, and having them kind of participate in what we do in a way that feels, like a great message, talking about the farm, talking about the oyster, talking about the process, and being able to present that to the guests in a way that feels we're representing their product in the right way.
So for us, because at Pesh we serve Gulf seafood, that's really how the conversation starts. We're very loyal to a lot of our farmers and growers, and when the trust is established, the relationship grows and it lengthens, and as long as the farmers are willing to provide us with the product, we're happy to serve it at the restaurant as long as they trust us to do it. That's really yes, the product is important, the oyster and the quality and all of that, but really more importantly, it's about the relationship and the farmers. That's probably most of our focus.
I think the farm is it's very different than our other locations. At our other locations, it's expected to have a variety. So there's East Coast, there's, at least 3 of our oysters on, but at the farm, we mainly try and do just Hog Island product. But I think what's important with the relationships is when our bay is closed and we don't have our product, the knowledge that we can give to our staff and the backstory of the farms that we've, grown our relationship with is super important.
Yeah, so our relationship as a company with oysters, it's really been kind of interesting because I feel like so the company's been around since '98 and started just on the land-based protein side of things, and about 14 years ago, we got into seafood and didn't know where it would go. I started with the company 12 years ago, and that was right around, I think I had my first farm-raised oyster from the Gulf. Steve Crockett provided some Point of Pines, and I just didn't know what to think and didn't understand what a farm-raised oyster was. And started to learn about those. And at the time at Evans, we were only really selling a handful of oysters, period. And the ones that we did have were just, we were still able to get some stuff out of Apalachicola. So that kind of went away, and then we had to kind of take a step back and try to figure out, okay, if we're going to do an oyster program, what does this look like? For us as a company, when we hit the mark properly, we are always trying to find something unique, something that has a reason to be in our warehouse and to be able to offer to our chef partners. And so we started to see this resurgence, or the inception of Southern farm-raised oysters. We wanted to latch onto that, and we felt that fit our personality, fit our company, it fit our focus. And 12 years later now, it's a great problem, but we are trying to figure out who do we select? How do we select them? Because we can't sell everybody's oysters, but we do have out of necessity, we have a pretty well-rounded oyster program that includes both West and East Coast. But I would say, I was looking at it yesterday on our offerings to our customers. We probably had about 25 different varietals of oysters to offer. And about 17, 18 of those were all Southern oysters, whether that be from the Gulf or also from North Carolina, the Atlantic coast of Florida as well. So it's pretty awesome to see that we have access to all of these things right now. So that's kind of our relationship on the oyster program.
Yeah, I think, speaking from a landlocked perspective too, we're a big Evans customer. And
thank you.
Probably one of the biggest. And we source a lot of our we source all of our southern oysters through Evans, but when we buy East Coast or West Coast, we still, for the most part, do direct to chef because we love having those relationships too. But I imagine for a lot of restaurants like ours, you end up, I'm very involved in Oyster South. I'm getting out to farms from time to time. For a lot of the restaurants y'all sell to, you are the intermediary. So you're helping cultivate that knowledge and those relationships and tell that story too. Okay, so.
Was that a question?
Well, I don't know, prompt. Jamie or Jeremy, if you want to expand on a little bit more, because Jeremy, your experience was starting a restaurant with Island Creek, and Jamie, you're running a farm restaurant. Just maybe speaking, going back to our panel yesterday about revenue streams, maybe kind of like if you have any stories about the joys or the specific challenges of those experiences.
I mean, I think the joy of being the farm chef in Marshall is just the space itself. I hear so many stories of people, it's their first oyster experience. They've made core memories with their families, with their friends at that specific location. And I think John and Terry's impact is what makes it so special, being there.
So it's, people kind of have the perception of, restaurants, kind of this romantic notion of it must be fun to be in the restaurant business, or it must be so fun to be an oyster farmer. It's easy, you're out on the water, it's relaxing. Both of those are not true. They're really hard. So when you combine those things, it can be difficult. And they're really, at the end of the day, they're both businesses, right? You're growing oysters to hopefully sell and make money. I'm shucking oysters and putting them on ice, hopefully to sell and make money. And when and those two worlds are collide, sometimes it causes friction. And it just takes great communication, great expectation between both parties on how those things are going to work. And sometimes when you have the name of an oyster farm on the door and you don't have those oysters because of it's winter or whatever the reason, it creates challenges that you need to be ready for. So there's always kind of friction built in. But the upside is when you can close for a day and put your staff on a bus and take them to an oyster farm, and they're out in the water and shucking oysters and talking to the farmers, and it's a beautiful day in Duxbury. I mean, there's a lot of buy-in when you can do that, and they will go back and just organically that story and that feeling flows through the restaurant, and they get to talk about those things, and they've been to Duxbury and they've eaten the oysters, and we try to do that with other oyster farms. So it's a business on both sides, and making sure that the communication is really good, but there's always challenges, and chefs and oyster farmers are not the best communicators, and sometimes to each other, so it certainly caused it could be tension, but there was a lot of amazing things that came out of it. But it was a pretty rare situation where myself as a chef partnered with an oyster farmer to open a restaurant. There's a lot of oyster farms that do restaurants and a lot of chefs that sell oysters, but it was it was different. But it was we had a really long run that was really successful, but not without its challenges. And I think that the farm and the restaurant need to set expectations early to make sure that everyone's understands what they're getting into.
So going more into relationships, I think one of the topics that comes to mind is what are the biggest challenges you encounter when receiving oysters or shucking oysters? And kind of going off of the relationship theme, what are you willing to work through with farms, and what kind of recurring problems do you see that will cause you to stop buying a product? And maybe a follow-up to that is in general, how important is consistency when it comes to size, salinity, flavor, all those attributes?
I'll go because I'm holding the microphone, but I think you have to be, as a restaurant, you have to be very flexible with an oyster farm. Things change. They're out in the weather. It's not manufacturing. They're growing, and there's a lot of challenges that come with that. How the oyster's flavor might change from the amount of rain or lack of rain, or weather. You just have to be flexible. I think for me, it's we don't mind taking that ride with the oyster farm. And the one thing I will say to all the oyster farmers is over communicate with what's going on. Be honest about what's happening with the restaurant. I think good restaurants aren't going to drop you because you don't have oysters one week. They shouldn't. They should be understanding that what you're doing is really challenging, and you might not have the same oysters week in, week out. You might need a break to kind of find that. They should be able to, go on that ride with you throughout 12 months a year or whenever you have oysters, and be, consistent and communicate really well. I think if the oyster size is a little different, or the shape's a little different, or the flavor profile is changing a little bit, and you can communicate that with the chef or the restaurant, and you have a good relationship with them, and you're consistent. I think they should take that ride with you. I think that's an important part of the process. It's going to change. It's a creature growing in the ocean.
I think the biggest challenge, space. We need a bigger walk-in. Just kidding. But no, really, I think sometimes, it's understandable when the flavor profile of the oyster changes. That comes part and parcel with it for the year. It's a little bit difficult for the servers and for us to really explain that to the guest. They don't necessarily ask the questions or understand why that happens in the year. We don't stop buying oysters. We almost have never really dropped anyone. But I would say that would be the biggest challenge.
I think for us, I have a very small restaurant that, oysters are sort of few and far between on the menu because ultimately we don't have the capacity for the volume that we're quite used to in the city. Because, New Orleanians love an oyster bar. And I think for us, the challenges we face is, environmental impacts of, the weather for sure in South Louisiana. I mean, I think we get hit with storms all the time, and that creates the ebb and flow of availability to a lot of these small farmers. And, especially after Ida, the resiliency of these farmers to come back through those tribulations on a pretty consistent basis here. It's not an easy place to grow oysters, especially along the coast. So I think, the adaptability and the flexibility, like you're saying, to piggyback on that is kind of the utmost importance for us as chefs, and to articulate that to our customers. I think I think now the trend is more customers are asking for smaller oysters, in general. For me, as someone who grew up here, we grew up with just big slug oysters from the myriad of areas that we have in South Louisiana. So it's been a beautiful journey to see the way cultivations happen in South Louisiana in a way that has happened in the rest of the U.S. for a very long time. My first mind-blowing oyster was at Hog Island, the original location, when I was my 22nd birthday, when I moved out to California. I had never appreciated an oyster after living here my whole life until that point. And it was a mind-blowing experience. And I think that for me, opened my eyes to appreciating oysters and the variety, not just in the East and West Coast, but it made me thinking why aren't we doing this in South Louisiana? And this was almost 20 years ago. So to see that variable change so quickly in the last couple of decades here is such a breath of fresh air. But I think the difficulties do lie for us, I think, at least on the storm end, and the way that sort of affects these farmers on a yearly basis. So for us, it's just a beautiful way to engage with this, new cultivation of farmers. It's overwhelming the amounts now because, I'm such a small restaurant. We are only available to have a certain capacity in what we offer. So I think the biggest challenge for us is navigating, who we're going to choose. It's just such a beautiful spectrum of farmers and the microclimates and the changes in flavor. It's just incredible to see that be available to us now in a way in South Louisiana it's sort of never been. So, but I think the biggest difficulty I see is, the coming back after, storms, and as these storms increase every year and get worse, how is that going to affect, the longevity of how we have availability to these like beautiful micro cultivation areas?
I have a question. As it relates to some of the challenges, say, if we're talking about like, say, salinity levels, you have a big rain event and salinity levels are dropping, things of that sort. How do you feel like, say, for those of you that don't have, say, a direct relationship with the farmer that you can just call them and ask them what's going on, what would be the best way that farmers could communicate that, whether that be, say, through us as a distributor, or is it something they could even do on like social media, just kind of talking about the week ahead, what things are looking like, maybe what some of the profiles of the oysters are looking like? How could farmers better communicate some of these challenges that they're having so that you know?
I have no idea. They're farmers farm, right? That's their job. So for them to sit down and send long notes, or I just don't know that that's in the wheelhouse. I think on the restaurant side or the consumer side, like when you get the oyster and taste it, and make a note. Well, this batch is a little saltier, or a little more vegetal than the last one is, or make those notes. But the farmer's main job is to bring you quality oysters week in, week out, the best that they can. I don't know that asking them to do too much and take away from that core responsibility is the best use of their time. I think it's on the restaurant or the consumer to taste them and make those notes. And if you decide that it's a profile you want to get away from and try something else, that's up to the restaurant or the consumer. But I don't know that they should be held to that. I mean, if it's obvious or there's a big thing going on, a closure or whatever, yeah, of course, communicate that. But the nuances on the week in, week out, I probably shouldn't be on them.
Yeah, I think when it comes to taste and flavor, that's something that we do pretty regularly to adjust and explain it to the servers. That's not necessary. I think more so than not, when something isn't available, it's good to know why, so that we can tell the servers, like, hey, I know you're used to having this product on our menu. We can't have that because this is what's happening. And we may not have it for 2 weeks, so in case anyone asks.
What I would say is with size, salinity, those kinds of things, it is on us to taste. But we have a hard time sometimes finding people's stories. So as a place that carries so many different Gulf farms, it would be nice if there was, say, a tab on the Evans page even, where these guys could send in a paragraph, the same sort of things that Aaron and Jennifer were talking about yesterday, just kind of your story, that if it's generational or if it's a new startup or you're coming from a different industry. Those are really fun stories for the restaurants and the servers to tell. And just like maybe communicating salinity levels on a regular basis isn't the farm's responsibility, it's not necessarily the restaurant's responsibility to have to research all those details. So I would encourage a distributor to take that on, to make a Rolodex of that information.
Noted.
Okay, so Jackie, you mentioned one thing, which is that you're seeing more and more small oysters. So I have kind of a two-part question, and one is, what kind of trends are y'all seeing in your area, maybe that diners are asking for, or that even other chefs you're seeing do? And then the follow-up to that is about the size question specifically, is so many are trending small, and we always inform our servers, for instance, what's our small today and what's our large, because consumers have very different preferences in that regard. But how small is too small?
Right. No, I completely agree with that. I mean, there is like a threshold, I think, that, the trend is going towards the smaller oysters. You can pop it very easily. And as somebody who grew up here, used to like a very large oyster before this level of like focus to cultivation really began. You see that trend now, who are, also people who are used to those sizes, who have now had the availability locally and not just had to look to the West or East Coast for that size. Here is gravitating folks locally, I think, to, explore smaller oysters. I think too small, can be an issue, can be a price point issue for a lot of times for certain people. But I think, the average consumer that we see are gravitating towards that like kind of medium small because they associate it with maybe like, we used to associate Kumamoto's as like the small oyster, and you're seeing less of that now, and you're seeing more, of these microclimate cultivation areas that offer that same type of size, but locally. So, do we want to import Japanese? Or do we want to support the same size in our local community? So I think for us, certainly we present, you guys have like so much more volume and are able to carry such more variety in the way that I wish I could without turning into sort of an oyster bar, because that's really not what we are, but we do want to offer that. So we have to sort of like navigate that, size consistency, what I see here in New Orleans is, people want a nice briny, salty oyster, but they want like a level of sweetness too. So for us, I think, when we do a fried version, we're using like the area 3s and area 10s and 13s and that style, because we're so adept to having like a fried oyster that's very New Orleans. So you see those larger ones going to that direction. You see the smaller ones being prepared more sort of, delicately. But you definitely see that trend happening. People are just asking for small oysters. They'll ask you, hey, what size are these? Like before they even ask you about salinity, where they're from, they'll ask you about size first. So for us, we see that very, very heavy on the trend level.
What about on the East Coast or West Coast? Are y'all seeing demand for certain sizes or just trends in general?
I think for sure, I think the people are here just starting to realize like the availability of that size and like the variable nature of that exists in the West and East Coast that now we have here. So they're not having to really outsource that. And, Louisianans love to support Louisiana seafood. So I think that you're finding, like I know I love East and West Coast oysters, but I serve such little volume that I want to make sure that I'm highlighting Louisiana. So, but now the availability and the variables of size is like more than we can handle, because it's just such a beautiful sort of like journey that this has been on in cultivation for the last 20 years. To see that now available in customers, we have to educate them. I mean, it's all education, it's all relationships based. We know our oyster farmer. We know how many times he goes a week to Grand Isle. Drops them off at the restaurant. Like that level of relationship, and articulating that to the customer. And the customer loves a story. Like they want to know where they came from, who's harvesting them, what area. That is such a selling point, I think, outside of even just like the size nature of things. And you want to know that story, and Louisianans love that kind of stuff, so I think that's a huge selling point.
Yeah, a lot of, each restaurant's a little bit different, the expectations. I think some customers like the larger oyster, and we try to have a few of those. I think a lot of farmers in New England sell oysters as petites or regulars, and we try to have a nice mix of both of those across. And again, it's just consumer preference. We try to have a little bit of both. We and note those on the menu or describe those and let the consumer make the choice. I think there's less petites being sold now. I think the consumer's drawn towards more the regular size, average, 3-inch oyster in New England. I think the petites were trendy for a little while, but when, you're eating the same oyster that's just a little bit bigger, I think people have, caught on to that a little bit. So I would say that was the petites were kind of a big thing for a few years. I think it's going away from that, but we try to have a mix. One of my restaurants, for whatever reason, people love huge oysters, and I think it's just perception of value. They're getting a big oyster for their money. So great. You want a big oyster? I'll sell you a big oyster. So.
We sell 4 varieties of oysters at best, usually at any given time, 3 or 4. When they're ordering the Area 3 oysters, there are really people that request small. You'll say Area 3 request small. Obviously, that's out of our control. Sometimes the sack comes in the sack. For the farmed oysters, most of our guests assume that they're going to be smaller. I don't know that we've ever seen anyone really request them to be tiny. I think, just like what Jackie said, small, medium is usually kind of like the sweet spot for us.
Jamie, are y'all seeing anything specific on the West Coast?
We just like them very, very small.
Yeah.
Very.
So going into the conversation of price sensitivity, Jeremy, you sort of touched on it, but I know since the pandemic, so many prices have gone up in so many areas, and are you starting to see any reaction or feedback to customers? Do you feel like it's tipping the scales on how much you're selling? Anything you're noticing related to cost?
I think for us, we're kind of known for the premium seafood that we have, so that kind of comes like part and parcel with what we do anyway. And I think introducing, these new versions of cultivated oysters to people, like in the education part, brings the value, I think, to the customer as well. And I think that's so important to articulate to, like, with your service staff and making sure they're educated enough on it so they can bring value in even just the explanation of sort of like the style of oyster. I think the trickle-down economics of post-COVID, like we're all dealing with like crazy overhead increases, like, on a worldwide scale. So I think that's been a hard, like the consumer's starting to feel it now. But I think there's certain consumers that know the value and, understanding when you do educate them and be like, here's the process that these farmers go through for this product, and that's why the end game, this oyster costs what it costs. And some people are willing to pay for it, some aren't. And I think that having the variation, you guys at Passionable, like the variation you guys have comes with like variations of price point too. So like that's a great benchmark to have, because if you're not willing to pay, $3 for an oyster, you have a different side of the spectrum on that. So I think that the customers are feeling it for sure, and that comes with some feedback, negative or positive sometimes. But it's understanding that the work that goes into it, which is the payoff, and it's valuing the labor behind the end result. And I think educating the customer on that part is probably the most important part of them understanding, the cost increases.
What about you, JT? At Evans, have y'all seen any pushback from restaurants at all?
Yeah, so on oyster pricing? Yeah. So I think one thing that we do see is, so speaking to the farmers here right now, is nowadays kind of all oysters seem to be almost one price, right? Or they're very similar in pricing, where some value can be if your farm site allows for having not only, say, the oyster that you've been passionate about growing, that that beautiful 2.5 inch oyster that will go onto the raw bar. Always keep in mind that restaurants are needing to balance out their menu and their pricing. They're looking for areas in which they can reduce their cost and also build some more diversity into that menu. Not everybody's a raw bar. There's a lot of cooked oysters out there that restaurants are using. So I've always tried to encourage there to also be something that maybe could be a little bit lesser cost available from the farm. It's maybe something that you don't touch and tumble quite as much. Maybe it grows out a little bit larger for restaurants to be able to roast. I think there's a huge market for that because, like I said, there are far more people that are using oysters in more of a in a more of a, I guess, call it in a culinary application as opposed to just a raw bar. So, I know everybody's wanting to create the most beautiful oyster that they possibly can and continue doing so. If you have availability maybe on that site as well to grow out something a little bit larger for people to be able to shuck, roast, fry, whatever it might be, I'd encourage you to do so, because it can get crowded. At least when I present our oyster menu out to customers, I'm always looking at that and I'm going, damn, all right, everything's kind of that same price. It's all pretty high, but we do see a lot of kickback from customers asking about, what's something a little bit lower in cost, a little bit larger that I can use for a roasted oyster and do a special with, things of that sort. So something to keep in mind. And
I guess to the distributor conversation also, what do you do, like, if you have people who are unhappy with an end product, or if, say, a bag is harvested and it's fine at the farm, but because of extreme temperatures or shock or whatever, by the time it reaches the restaurant, there's a high percentage of dead oysters in a bag. Where does the responsibility kind of lie on like bridging that gap between restaurants and farms?
Yeah, so we see this obviously down here. It's summertime, right? It's always going from warm waters going into refrigeration very, very rapidly, staying on a cold truck. So as far as what we do in that, it's obviously very situational as to what exactly happened. The first thing we're going to do is, okay, is this something that we did? We're going to track, we keep all temp logs on every single truck. We're going to go through those. And then honestly, we're going to really contact the farmers and just kind of check in with them, see what also might be going on. What could be causing these issues with high mortality rates and in the bags of oysters that people are getting. But so ultimately, it's our job to make sure that the customers are happy. We want to take care of that immediately, and then we'll talk to the farmers and try to figure out a little bit more what's going on. Maybe we need to pause for a little bit or work together on figuring out how we just keep all of our customers as happy as possible. So I don't know. Is there anything else that we could be doing differently on that?
I have never had complaints with oysters with you guys. I think you do a pretty good job.
Sweet. Good. Cool. Awesome.
All right, we have about 6 or 7 minutes left. Do we have any questions for any of the chefs or for JT? Adam?
Yeah, so in Washington, at least, there's a strong seasonality to oysters, and there's a strong seasonality to restaurants, and they don't necessarily overlap, right? We talk about this a lot as a farmer, that right now, our oysters are prime, sales are slow. I mean, it's kind of a long shot and open-ended, but what efforts could be made to sort of link those up the way maybe they're more linked up in France? So it's kind of like changing people's culture around food and dining out. And you could talk about the weather, I guess, and its relationship to oyster sales.
We need a new holiday in February that focuses on oysters. I think would be good for everybody. There's a few months a year that I have hama-hamas on the menu, and it's now because we're in the winter in New England and I can't get as many oysters as I want, so we rely on, and it's a great opportunity for us to kind of go out in the world and see different oysters and bring those in and talk about them. But it's just the nature of what we do a little bit. It kind of ebbs and flows, and the summer oysters in New England aren't always great. You get those heat waves and people get shut down, or you get a ton of rain and get shut down, but that's when we sell the most. So I don't have a good answer for you. I'm just acknowledging you're absolutely right. It's horrible. But just trying to, I would just say developing new markets, going out into the world and trying to figure out where you can sell your oysters and get restaurants excited about, this is a time of year where our oysters are at their absolute best, and you should have them. And, that's how I would see it kind of shaken out the best that it could.
Offset that a little bit with making sure that you have relationships in retail, right? So people are going to continue to eat. It's just they might not be out at a restaurant. So you can sort of balance those out with retail a little bit. I don't know exactly how to tell you how to get into those retail outlets exactly, but I think it's important to have that and kind of keep a balanced portfolio, so to speak, of the customer.
Yeah, Adam, I don't know what y'all's, I don't think I've ever spoken to you about what your overall distribution is like, but does having restaurants like Henrietta Red buying from you, because our seasonality is obviously very different from the Seattle area. So does having a broader distribution network help with that problem overall? And so I had a question I didn't get to, but it's sort of similar, which is like restaurants like Jackie's that are not selling thousands and thousands of oysters a week. Obviously, those relationships might be a bit more work to cultivate for like a smaller payoff, but could also help to that end. Jackie or JT, do you have any like specific thoughts on kind of growing those kinds of relationships with restaurants that aren't oyster bars?
Yeah, I mean, we see it all the time. Every single week. We obviously, with our oyster selection, I can't. If we're breaking into a new market, the first person I'm going and talking to is the oyster bar there. But all restaurants are they're looking for something, running a special of some sort. So there is plenty of opportunity to work with oysters at restaurants that are not oyster bar focused. I mean, everybody's looking for something fun and unique to play with, and so yeah. Bill's got a question back there.
Go ahead and answer it. I was just letting Julia know we've got a question after that.
Okay.
Oh, you go.
Anything else?
Yeah, I think like in the way I guess the amount and style of oyster we present is so like kind of dialed in. It's for me, it's very difficult to choose. You want to support everybody, and everybody's doing such great work, and all these different variations down here. It's for me the struggle is like I want to support Louisiana oysters, but I love these East and West Coast varieties, right? So like, and I've served such few and far between on the oyster end that it is such a highlight when it is on the menu. So it needs to be like this, like why am I carrying this one today? Why it's I think a more kind of dainty presentation of it and a more I guess like accessible version, because Louisiana, like I said, just Louisianans love to support Louisiana seafood. So I think that I feel like this duty to really highlight who we have available here, and I think the biggest difficulty is like choosing who that's going to be, because you can't have everybody. So it's got to be like maybe a rotational basis, so that the customer is, sort of either identifying like this new version of Louisiana oysters they're not quite used to, because we grew up with big, fried oysters from this like. I have this like core memory of like being at an oyster bar at the Riverwalk when I was a kid, right down the street, and my brother's just completely destroying like these huge slug oysters with like ketchup on them, and that made me like disgusted towards oysters like as a kid. And it wasn't until I moved to California and went to Hog Island to have like this version of this like epiphanous moment of like what oysters can be, and not just like what we knew as growing up here. So I think that that's still incarnate to a lot of the local South Louisianians, and I think that when we can carry these like very and it's we'll carry two different styles or two or three kinds. But I think that it's important to diversify that for our customer base here in South Louisiana, who's like just kind of getting on board with the level of cultivation and variety that we have now.
So I saw this in Maine this past summer. Do you see a way to save consumers money by allowing them to shuck their own oysters in the restaurant? Hand them a bucket and a knife and, save $1 an oyster?
I couldn't really hear
The
that.
question is about, can you save on labor by having consumers shuck their own?
In the restaurant?
That's a liability.
That sounds
for me.
dangerous.
I mean, I think in some farm restaurant settings, it probably does make sense. Like Adam was talking a little bit about yesterday. I think for us, for our like kind of oyster bar, high volume oyster bar model, it would be very difficult. I have a hard time getting it up, my shuckers to be able to move the volume we need to move. I think having customers do that would be difficult.
We have a large variety of customers. We have public customers that come to the boat that we arrange, and we have distributors. We also go directly to restaurants. But there is a class of customer that wants a big oyster to make an entree and to put it on a grill and not as an appetizer. Will you all accept a different price point for a large oyster? Because we got to put a lot more time in and work to make a large oyster than it is to make the appetizer and a boutique oyster. So I'm just throwing that out there.
From my perspective, most of the time, if someone's wanting that larger oyster to cook, they want it to be at lower price.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think the trend is.
I understand. I know, right? So.
And I think like the customer like association with like a more smaller, delicate oyster is a higher price point, and they look at like a larger, like bigger South Louisiana oyster as a lower price point because they think that the smaller one is more delicately cultivated. And I think that's just like a consumer like mindset.
At least in California, ours is reversed. I mean, an extra small is our cheapest, then a small is the next tier up, and then a medium's the highest because it takes about 3 years for that medium to grow. Yeah. And that's what we try to educate the customer on is all that time, effort, and labor that goes into that.
Yeah. All right, so I have to jump in. I know you're at time, but I just want to point out there, in the East Coast and the Gulf Coast, we have wild options that don't have to be grown, so they don't have those costs. So if you're looking at the supply, I can get big oysters cheaper from the wild than I can from growing them. And it may not be economical to grow a big oyster and charge it because there's an alternative in the marketplace. Yeah. They are.
I think also in terms of really big oysters, even at our restaurant, I mean, I would venture to guess what we're using for grilling is still considered fairly small. And then, we sometimes do fried options, but not all the time. And so I think also, it would be interesting to expand kind of, especially in landlocked areas where we don't have as many like coastal traditions. It'd be interesting to kind of like expand people's idea of what you can do with an oyster, which is something we've talked about with Bill a little bit before because it's such a cost-effective protein. But I think it's hard at restaurants like ours for people to really imagine the possibilities, if that makes sense. Cool, I think we're done.
All right, how about a big round of applause for the panel that Julia pulled together? Thank you all.